The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everybody, welcome to Unit 6 of the Lunch and Learn series, our last day before Easter, so let's get underway. Welcome wherever you are and look forward to working with you in our very last unit in the whole series. So it seems to have gone very quickly, but I'm sure, obviously it's been run over several months, but nevertheless, let's get underway and look at this very interesting topic of developing team culture. We've covered a lot of territory over the last few months and we'll continue to do so today as well. Okay, so what you can see on your screen very shortly is the list of the units that we've covered over the Lunch and Learn series. Now, I don't intend to go through each one of those again, but you can see that we've been on a bit of a journey and we've got finally to Unit 6. So I'm hoping that you've had an opportunity to apply what you've learned. I've thrown a lot of things at you and I wasn't expecting that you were going to do everything, but I'm hoping that you've tried a few things. And more importantly, I hope that you've got some good results out of trying a few things, because that's the name of the game, of course, is to put into practice a few things to help build that high-performing team. So let's get underway. Now, you might recall 2 weeks ago we looked at the negotiation and conflict resolution model from Thomas Kilmann, and the important key point out of the model, we got you to complete the survey, and what the survey was doing was to show you your predisposition to one of these 5 approaches. So collaboration, competing, accommodation, avoiding and I missed one, have I? Avoiding and competing, yeah. So those 5, and the whole point about the exercise was to use different approaches in different situations. So one will not always work for you. And what we tend to do is we tend to gravitate to the one that we feel the most comfortable using. But often that approach isn't the right approach when you consider the other person or persons that you're trying to that you're involved in negotiation or conflict with, and also the situation that you're in may call for a different approach. So that's what we covered, and your homework, of course, was to apply those 5 styles in different situations and pretty much broaden your capacity to engage with people when there's a difference of viewpoint. And obviously, as a team leader, there are always opportunities to have a difference of viewpoint with other people. Okay, the normal process is that when you've got questions or comments, just go to the question box and type them in and I'll pick them up as soon as I see them. But again, we're going to be covering 3 key points today. First of all, I want to spend a bit of time on culture, because I think when this word's used quite a lot, it's a bit like empowerment. People use it regularly, perhaps too often. So let's understand what we mean by culture. Why is it important and what does it look like? So we're going to spend a bit of time doing that. I'm going to spend a bit of time obviously talking about strategies for developing team culture. So your team has a culture. Now, there's no such thing as no culture. All teams have a culture. The question really is it a positive, productive culture, or is it the opposite, a negative, destructive culture? And then I'm going to spend a bit of time on my work on my latest book, which is called Winning Teams, and talk a little bit about the concept of team identity, which is a similar kind of concept to culture. And then we're done. So as I said, if you've got questions or comments, jump in at any time that you feel comfortable. Now, let's define what we mean by culture to get things moving. So this is my definition of culture. And of course, if you Google team culture or even just organizational culture, you'll get myriad responses. You'll get, pages and pages, and all the definitions will be slightly different. But at the end of the day, this is my definition, and that is It's a basic pattern of shared assumptions, values, and beliefs considered to be the correct way of thinking about and acting on problems and opportunities facing teams. So I've highlighted the key words there because a culture is a pattern of behaviour, or so it means that you don't just see something happening once, you see it happening many times. And you don't only just see it happening many times by one person in the team, but you see that most people in the team are engaged in that sort of behaviour. And it's underpinned by certain beliefs and assumptions and values, and it's considered to be the correct way of thinking and acting. Well, whether it is the correct way or not is another question, but certainly in the team, your people understand what's correct and incorrect in terms of the way they deal with each other. Probably the more simple definition of this would be the way we do things around here is a very simple definition of culture. So it's interesting that when any group of people get together anywhere, over a period of time, a culture is developed because people want to know where they stand, and they're looking for, the norm behaviour that needs to be conducted when they're working in that group of people. So you have a culture in your team. The question that you've got to ask is it a good culture? Is it a culture that's effective? Could it be more effective? What do you need to do to try to improve the culture of your team? And all of those things I'm going to cover in the hour we're together today. So, culture, of course, has two components to it. One component of culture is, of course, a part of the culture that we can see. So a good analogy is to use the iceberg. And the iceberg, of course, when it's in the water, the tip of the iceberg usually is above the water line, and below the water is a whole lot of the iceberg, a whole chunk of the iceberg. And of course, we can see what's above the water if we're above the water, and we can't necessarily see what's below the water. So when you think about it, so there are explicit and implicit aspects of culture. So, the way people are dressed, where they sit, the language that they use, the rituals and ceremonies, the stories people tell, the way they deal with each other, all of these things are visible and observable, and anyone could walk in. I mean, I could walk in tomorrow to your team and I could see these features very quickly because they're obvious, they're out there, they're above the waterline. But of course, below the waterline, there are a whole bunch of other things that aren't so obvious. And these are things like beliefs and values and assumptions that hold the team together. And whilst it might become obvious after a while of observing behaviour what these beliefs, values and assumptions are, it's not until I've observed it for a period of time, because these things, of course, are unspoken. And these are the things that will drive the team, but are not necessarily very obvious. So that's another dimension of culture that's important. And I guess there's some reasons that we have a culture in a team. And I just run through those with you, starting at 12 o'clock there and moving clockwise. The whole purpose of a culture is it serves as a sense-making and control mechanism. So it gives people some clarity around what's acceptable and unacceptable behaviour, what's acceptable and unacceptable, language and so forth. So that's one of the reasons, and people want to feel safe. So they will stick to the narrow confines of the culture of the team. Another reason that we have culture moving clockwise is that it defines the boundaries. So it gives us some clarity around what's appropriate and inappropriate behaviour in the team. And people, human beings, need that. They need those boundaries. And they need to understand what it means to belong to that team. It gives the team a sense of identity, in the sense that they kind of, they understand, it sharpens the focus of what they're involved with and in. And it makes a commitment beyond self-interest. So a culture means that people have to think beyond themselves. and so forth. And therefore, that's how people treat each other, and how people treat each other will be very, very dependent on the culture of the team. And of course, it adds a degree of stability because the behaviour is very clear and obvious in most cases. So when you have a new person enter the team, their antennae is up, and they're trying to assess what's appropriate and inappropriate, and it adds a degree of stability to what's going on. A good example of that is I was working the other day in a government department, and a new person in the team told me that they were obviously wanting to create a good impression, so they were staying beyond 5 o'clock and working in the office. And one of the other team members pulled them up after a couple of weeks and said to them that they really should leave at 5. And of course, the startled new person said, "Why?" And the person said, "Well, if you don't, it'll show us all up." So that's a classic case of culture being enacted. And culture can be enacted in a positive or a negative way as well, of course. So that's the purpose of a culture. So let's talk a little bit more about how you might measure culture. Now, here's a really great exercise that you can do in your team, and you'll find you'll get really interesting results and insights. And I'll share with you a couple of clients who've gone through this process just to give you a flavour of how effective it is. Essentially what happens is in your next team meeting, have a conversation about culture. But instead of starting by saying, "Well, what do you think our culture is?" and you're likely to get a lot of blank faces and stunned looks, ask them 3 key questions. The first question is, if you had to describe our team as a colour, what colour would it be and why? All right, so we're using metaphors to bring to the surface how people perceive the culture of the team. The second question that you ask is, if you had to describe our team as an animal, what animal would it be and why? Again, the animal is the metaphor. And finally, if you had to describe our team as a motor vehicle, what vehicle would it be and why? And you'll find it's fascinating when you go around the group. So give people a chance to absorb the questions, get them to even write down their responses, and then go around the room and ask people if they could identify the colour, the animal and the vehicle, and of course why they have picked that and why they picked those 3 symbols. And you'll find something very interesting, apart from having a good laugh, because a lot of people are quite creative and they'll come up with all sorts of interesting kind of responses to this. You'll find that you'll see some common themes running through your team. And these common themes, of course, are the essence of culture. Now, I did this with 2 organisations several years ago now, and one of them was Queensland Rail. And at the time, the culture was very poor in the whole organisation and the team I was working in particular. And that was one of the reasons that I was in there, to try to help build a better team culture. And we went around the table in this team and we asked them exactly these 3 questions. And the common colour was black, and the reason being that we're not terribly exciting. And that was pretty much the rationale. 2 was the animal. The animal that they selected was an elephant, and you could probably work out why. They felt that they were slow to change, didn't respond well, and often I think someone else said, "We never forget." And then the motor vehicle was a Holden car. And the reason for that was that people had their father working there and their grandfather working there, and it was very much seen as a family type business, or at least team. And so they picked a sort of like a typical family car. So it was very, very interesting. So you might want to try it. And another organisation I did this was IBM. And this was when IBM was in its heyday. And the colour that they selected was gold, because they felt that they were number 1 in this senior team. The animal they selected was a cheetah, because they were fast moving and ready to change. And the third, the vehicle, was the Ferrari with all the bells and whistles, because they thought they were number one and quite agile and all the rest. So you can actually get really interesting responses. So I strongly recommend that you try that. Now, if you do go ahead and do this, the other thing that you can do is then say to your team members, okay, if we could wave a wand and, change or improve our culture, what would be the color, the animal, and the vehicle that you'd select? So what we've done is we've created, by doing that exercise, a before and after snapshot. Where do they see themselves now? Where do they see themselves in the future? And it can be very, very interesting. And of course, the next step is to ask how we might go from A to B. So you could use literally these three questions to start crafting a new culture in your team, and it works extremely well. So that's one simple way of getting a handle on the team culture, and a simple way of improving it as well. A more complicated approach, but nevertheless it's quite thorough, is this little descriptor here, and you can see that there are a number of dimensions around team culture. So if you want to be a bit more scientific about it, you can go through and ask people to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 on each of these dimensions. And this gives you a very good handle on how people see themselves against some key indicators or key dimensions of culture. So the extent to which people have initiative, the tolerance to risk in the team. So obviously, if it was a startup IT company, it's probably going to have a high tolerance to risk, whereas if it's a highly regulated government department, it's probably going to have a very low tolerance to risk. The direction, the degree to which the team has a very clear objective. So in a not-for-profit organisation where there is a single issue that the not-for-profits are working towards, there'll be a clear direction. Integration is the degree to which the team's encouraged to cooperate and work together as a unit. Management contact, the degree to which management have contact with the team, or is the team pretty much isolated and allowed to do its own thing? The extent of the control, that is the regulations and rules that govern the team's behaviour. Is it high or low, and so forth. The identity of the team, the degree to which members feel a part of the team, probably more so than the organisation as a whole. Any reward systems that are in place, are rewards based on employee performance indicators, or are there no rewards? Conflict tolerance, which is of course the topic in Unit 5, the degree to which employees are encouraged to air their conflicts and criticisms openly, and communicate and their communication patterns, the degree to which the organisation communicates. The communication is restricted to formal lines of communication. So in other words, people don't talk to other people in other teams unless they go through their team leader. So that's a more scientific approach, if you like, and it can give you some really interesting indicators. And bearing in mind the organisation from which you belong and the industry from which you belong will obviously have a huge bearing on the culture of your team, because the organisational culture will permeate the team, but the team still has a distinct culture. And so by doing one of these two exercises, you can come to terms with what that culture actually looks like and how you might tinker with it to improve it. And the best way to improve a team culture is to actually get the team involved in that process, rather than you as the team leader attempting to do that on your own. Because of course it's based on the principle that if people own it, they're likely to commit to it. So there's two little exercises that you can use, which I think you'll find very instructive. Now, there's a very interesting article with a wonderful title that was written several years ago by O'Reilly and Tushman, and they call this article the Ambidextrous Organisation. Now, ambidexterity, as we know it, is typically about left-handed or right-handed. So somebody who's ambidextrous as a tennis player, for example, can play tennis with their right hand or their left hand with reasonably equal capability. So organisations, or teams in this case, need to be ambidextrous, according to these two authors. And what they're saying basically is that on the one hand, the team needs to be quite exploratory. And what I mean by that, exploitive. In other words, what I mean by that is they need to be following rules and regulations and processes and procedures when it's appropriate to do so. So we expect, you can't just have a team flying by the seat of its pants. There are certain things that have to be done in certain ways, and that's important. But you don't want a team to be completely rule-bound and completely process-driven. So on the other hand, the team also needs to have some degree of ability to capture or seize opportunities. It needs to be entrepreneurial. It needs to be agile. And all of these things, of course, that we're talking about today in the literature. So your team has a challenge of having a good balance between being process-driven on the one hand and entrepreneurial on the other. And the argument is that you can be both. It's not easy, but of course, if you're one or the other and it dominates, then the effectiveness of the team is diminished somewhat. So even in a highly regulatory environment, there is a time and a place to be entrepreneurial. And in a highly entrepreneurial environment, there's a time and place to knuckle down to a process. So in fact, both of those things are important. And the challenge for you as a team leader is to try to develop a culture that is both left-handed and right-handed, according to this model. So that becomes an interesting challenge for you. And one of the simplest ways of doing that, I might say, is if you get your team together and you've got a whiteboard in front of you and you draw two lines down the whiteboard. And on the left-hand side, so you've basically got three columns. On the left-hand side, you ask the team all of the things that have to be done by the book. So these are all the things that have to be done pretty much by process, and you make a list of those things. Then you go to the other side, which is the right-hand column, the far right-hand column, and you ask people, what are all the opportunities where we can be free to make decisions without being bound by rules? Now, you'll probably find that this list isn't quite as long, so you might have to just push people a little bit. But nevertheless, draw the list out, and then you finish up with the middle column. And the middle column is, what are those things that can either be done by the book or, through your own initiative? And it's interesting that middle column is the column that get people into trouble. Most people know when they've got to follow things by the book. And I guess in some senses, if you have been encouraging, most people will show initiative when they need to. But that middle column is an area of interest because often what happens in a rule-bound organisation is that the things that can either be done by the book or be done through initiative will be done by the book. The reason being is, of course, it's the path of least resistance. It's safer. I can't get into trouble if I follow a system. And if anyone blames me later on, I can just say I was following the rule book. So that's one way of cultivating a conversation in your teams around when it's appropriate to be entrepreneurial and when it's appropriate to be rule-bound, regardless of the industry that you come from. So that's an interesting thought that you might want to give some further consideration to. Now, in one of my books, Performance Management for Agile Organizations, that I wrote last year, I put together a model of agility. And the reason I put a model of agility together is that I found that we talk a lot about agility, we all do, but the truth is we haven't defined it, or we certainly hadn't defined it when I wrote the book. So I thought, well, I'm going to have a go at this and start to define what agility actually looks like. And so I came up with 7 dimensions of agility. And so think about your own team in the context of these dimensions, starting at 12 o'clock. All teams to some degree have to be innovative. That is, they have to think about ways and means of doing things faster, smarter, safer, easier, more cost effective, and so forth, because obviously there's not an infinite bucket of money. So teams have to have some innovation. Processing means that teams need to be able to process things rather quickly. So, when a customer or internal stakeholder, whoever it is that deals with you, when they want their thing dealt with, it normally has to travel through several hands. How quickly is it that the team can actually process something and get it back to the person requiring it? Now, obviously, you want to try and reduce the amount of time and maintain the quality of whatever it is that you're supplying. The next one's very interesting. It's recovery. We all make mistakes. Teams make mistakes. Individuals make mistakes. It's just part of life. I'm sure you'd agree. So really what we're trying to do there is to say that when we've made a mistake, how quickly can we recover from it? Because most people are quite forgiving if mistakes are rectified quickly. But most people are very unforgiving when mistakes are not rectified, or they're rectified in a very slow way. In other words, they're not a high priority. So how quickly do you recover from mistakes? How quickly do you continuously improve your systems, your processes, the way you do business? And innovation and continuous improvement are different. Innovation's coming up with a completely new way of looking at something, whereas continuous improvement is building on what's already there. But both of those things are important to any agile team. How responsive are you to your customers? Now, your customers may not be customers as we know it. They may be internal service providers. You might be internal service providers and you've got people to deal with inside your organization. So how quickly are you able to, or not so much quickly, but how effectively are you at dealing with your stakeholders? Okay. Problem solving. How do you go about problem solving? Do you do that in an agile way, or do you just stick to the tried and proven ways that I mentioned earlier? So how good are you as a team at doing that? And finally, all of these things are about changing direction. So number 7 on the list there is pretty much a culmination of all the other 6. And that is, how quickly can your team change direction when it needs to? And let's face it, it will need to, if not now, certainly in the future. And it's about changing direction nimbly and competently, with a minimum amount of fuss. That's really important for an agile team. So you might want to take that model and start looking at your own team. And if you're trying to build up the ambidexterity of your team, and you're looking at the entrepreneurial side of your team, you can take this model and start to build on that. So you want to be able to tick all those boxes. And if you can tick all those boxes, then the argument is that you're a reasonably agile organization or an agile team. So you might want to look at that a little further after the, of course, you get the slides as normal, and the audio, the recording as well at the end of this. Now, in another one of my books, I put together what was called a team values charter. This is a very, very effective way at building a culture up in a team in a very quick way. And I have actually been very surprised at how incredibly effective this is. I've done it myself with many teams, and I know many teams have done it with themselves. It's based on 4 questions. So you get your team together, normally during a meeting, and you ask them to write down the answers to 4 questions. And don't try and get them to do this before the team meeting, because inevitably law of averages would indicate that 1 or 2 of your team members will have forgotten to have done it, and then you've got to wait for them. So do it in the team meeting, and you simply ask these questions, and you ask people to write down the answers. Why do I want them to write it down? Well, I want them to actually think about it. So the first question I'm going to ask is, what is one value that's important to you when working in teams? Or you might say, when working in this team. Now, I've given you an example on the screen there just to give you a flavour of how it might unfold. So I might write down the word respect. So in my view, respect is critically important when I'm working in a team. Question 2 is, what is your definition of that value? So this gives people a chance to start to put a few words around that value to explain what they mean by it. Because let's face it, if I used respect, respect could mean different things to different people. All it is a label, so I want to actually hear what people have got to say about it. So I might say in a team meeting, if I was asked, respect is when people are prepared to listen to others, even when they may not agree with their point of view. All right, so that's my definition of respect, but that might be completely different to somebody else's. So you get them to write that down. Question 3 is, why is that value important to you? Now, this gives you a really interesting insight into your team and why they hold the values they hold. And so I might say, well, I like to feel that I'm respected and my opinion's valued when working with others. So that's my definition of respect, and that's why it's important to me. All right, and then question 4 is, and this is where the rubber meets the road, what behaviours would be consistent with that value? So I'm now asking people to give me some tangible behaviours that would underpin that value. So I might say, for example, not interrupting someone when they speak. I would say that's a sign of respect, even if they don't agree with me. Now, you get everyone to write that down, so that'll take you, maybe 10, 15 minutes, go through that, and then you simply go round the room and ask each people to respond to the question. Now, important couple of tips here. Do it yourself, of course. So you, of course, are a member of the team, despite the fact that you've got a team leader role. So you write down your value and the subsequent 3 questions, and you start the ball rolling by sharing your information. And then you go round the team and ask everyone else to do the same thing. Now, you'll find it's very interesting. You may well find that some people have got a similar value. You may find that some have got completely different values, but just listen respectfully to everybody's response and encourage other people to ask questions and make comments about the various values. So the whole idea is to make this a dialogue, not a monologue. So get everybody involved in the process. Now, when you've completed that exercise, you've now created what we call a team values charter. And what that means is that we've now collected a bunch of values that everybody's bought into, albeit individually, that we can now turn into a charter. And I've actually seen teams that have actually framed this on the wall where they meet. I've seen teams you put this on their screensaver on their computer. I've seen teams do all sorts of interesting things with their charter. And what you've actually created is something that people will hold themselves accountable for. First of all, as the team leader, you can hold people accountable for these values. That's the first thing. So you can look at everything through the prism of these values rather than just, did they complete the project correctly or whatever. Now, that's one good piece of, that's one constructive thing that comes out of it. The other thing that's very important here is that after a while, if people really buy into this, and I suspect they will, you'll actually find that people will hold each other accountable. So you'll find that people will pull each other up based on the team values charter, and that's a good thing because you've now created a culture around a series of values that we've all bought into. And I'd suggest to you that if you've got a new team member come on board, that you get them to go through the 4 questions and you add that on and you amend the values charter to include their response. If someone leaves, I personally feel you should keep their value in the charter, despite the fact that they've moved on. And that sends a very powerful signal to the other team members that your opinions are valued, even to the point when you are no longer part of the team, we will still uphold your value. All right, so it sends a great message to the other team members as well. So I can strongly recommend it. Give it a go. You'd be surprised how incredibly powerful it is. And you might say, yes, but we have a plaque on the wall with a set of values. We all organisations do, and people just walk past it and they hardly even notice it. And the reason for that is very simple. It's a simple concept, and that is that people did not have a say in the charter. All right. So because they didn't have a say in the charter, there's no buy-in. So by doing this team values charter around the table, you're actually getting people to buy into the charter by sharing their particular beliefs and views around how they want to be treated working in this team. So it's very powerful. Now you might say, well, I've got a well-established team. Doesn't matter. You can start any time you want. If it's a new team or a team that's well established, a team values charter will inject a new layer of accountability in the team, and that's very important. You might say, but yes, but the organisation's got values. That's okay. These values are only applicable for the team and how the team behaves with each other. So it's fine to have that in your own team environment. So strongly recommend that exercise. Any questions at this point? Please, I'm happy to address any questions that people have got or any comments. All right. Well, we're moving through this reasonably quickly, and I just wanted to talk to you about a concept called team identity. Now, you could substitute the word culture for identity. It's really up to you. But in my view, a team identity is, or you creating your own team identity, is extremely important. Moreover, you're probably doing it without even realizing it. And I just wanted to share with you a model that I put together in my latest book, which I think you might find very interesting. And I've called, there's three particular dimensions that are critically important to create team identity. And you can see them on your screen there. There's buffering, bridging, and building. So let me actually explain what buffering, bridging, and building is all about and how they fit in. Buffering is a process where you protect the team from disruptive elements outside the team. Now, you'll find, of course, no team works in isolation. And of course, what happens is that people will attempt at different times, whether they do it consciously or unconsciously, will attempt to sabotage the team. For example, you have another computer that's not being used. It's not being used because you're waiting to recruit someone to fill that role. But someone outside the team wants that computer, and maybe they go in and just take it for themselves, knowing full well, or thinking at least, that nobody's using that computer, so why can't I take it? So to a certain extent, a team has got to isolate itself to some, not too much, obviously. If you isolate yourself too much from the rest of the organisation, then you become redundant. But you have to some degree, protect the team. You have to protect your human resources. You have to protect your technical resources. You have to protect your administrative resources from being exploited. Another example would be that if you've got a member of a team and someone wants to second them into another team, it could be quite disruptive to your team. So you've got to be able to deal with all those things. So buffering is an extremely important part of team building. It might sound counterintuitive, but by putting a buffer around your team, you are protecting it from other outside influences that are likely to impact on the team. So that's one. Now, another one would be bridging. Now, that's the exact opposite of buffering. So all the while you're protecting the resources of the team, you should also be making bridges with other stakeholders and other end users that the team engages with. Because let's face it, without the cooperation of key stakeholders, you're going to be in a lot of strife. So obviously you might say, well, that's my job as the team leader. Well, I agree with you. I think it is pretty much your job. But I would also say that other people in the team have got alliances with other people that perhaps you don't. But whatever it is, you need to build bridges between your team and those teams you service, or those other stakeholders that supply the team with the resources that they need. So you've got these dual things. One's an internal focus where we're protecting the team, and one's an external focus where we're actually building alliances up with key stakeholders in order for us to be a more effective team. That makes sense. And then you've got building. Now, building is an internal job. This is about building a robust team culture, which is essentially, of course, what our unit today is all about. So what we're doing in the building phase is we're looking at our internal processes, systems, beliefs, values, and what we're trying to do is to create a more robust, well-functioning unit, because by doing that, of course, we'll be more effective at buffering ourselves when we need to, and we'll be more effective at bridging the distance between ourselves and those outside the team that we rely on to get our work done. So this is a very interesting strategy, and one that I put together, which I think, obviously in the book I go through in detail how you can do those three things and what's required, and here's some practical tools and so forth. So that's another model that you might find useful when you're considering your team. And in many respects, if you look at buffering, bridging, and building, those three things are clearly your responsibility ultimately. But I suspect that you should again tap into your team resources on how you might go about that. Just got a question here from someone who's asking, if you do too much buffering, don't you isolate yourself from the team? Okay, well, thanks, Jacinta. That's a good question. Yes, you do. You've got to be careful. You've got to be mindful, and that's why we've got those two there, buffering and bridging. So buffering is just only one element, and that is to protect the team. So it's not so much about saying no to everything, but being very selective. So sticking up for your team when you need to do that is part of the buffering process. For example, your manager might say to you that they're not happy with someone's work in your team. And instead of you exposing them, that is your team member, to that criticism, you might then say to the person in the team, listen, be careful, you've got a target on your back. The concern that they have is X, Y, and Z, and I'm more than happy to support you, but I need you to do this. So you kind of are buffering that person from the outside influence by giving them some feedback on your conversation with that manager. So you see, that's a good constructive buffering exercise, but of course, buffering too much means that the team is elitist, nobody can break in, and it becomes an isolated entity within an organization where nobody can do business with it. That's obviously going too far. So I hope that's answered your question. Thank you. It's a good question. So buffering, bridging, and building. So I've got some homework for you, and the homework that I'd like you to indulge in for this last unit is to give some thought when you get these slides, and I hope you get them this afternoon before Easter. You get these slides and get these recordings. What I want you to do is to go through it and pick something that resonated with you, whether it might be the animal, the colour of the vehicle, it could be that longer version of the key dimensions of team culture, it could be turning the organisation into an ambidextrous team. It could be around the concept of buffering, bridging, and building. Whatever it might be, take it and run with it. and try to start to develop and cultivate a more appropriate, more effective culture in your team. Remember, if you don't do anything, your team's still got a culture, right? Because it's an innate need that people have when they come together, is to have a kind of a way of doing business together. So it's already got a culture. As I said at the outset, the question is the culture effective? Is it working? Could it be more effective? So they're the things I want you to work on and implement a team culture strategy. So are there any other questions? Okay, well, this brings us to the end of the Lunch and Learn series for the team leaders. I've enjoyed working with you. We've covered a lot of ground, as I said at the outset, from when we started several months ago, and I've appreciated the opportunity of working with you. So I do want to wish you all a safe and happy Easter break. If you're having an extended break, then good luck to you. But even if you're only having the 4 days off, I'm hoping that you will enjoy that and be safe in what you do. Just before I finish the whole process here, I just wanted to give you a quick ad, if I may, and just to point out that I've got another Lunch and Learn series that's starting a couple of weeks after Easter. In fact, it's starting on the 24th of April. If you cast your eyes over the left-hand side, you'll notice that they're different topics, and this is more for senior managers or executives in organisations. Now, if you're that, it would be a natural transition for you to join me in the next Lunch and Learn series. And if you'd like to do that, I'm more than happy, because you're doing this today, to have a 10% discount to transition into this program. On the other hand, if there are people inside your organisation that you think would benefit from this, I'd be appreciative if you could actually send them out a note, perhaps even this slide, and let them know that very shortly I'll be starting another program. So just a quick plug before I finish up. So that's it from me, and as I said before, I wish you all the very best over Easter, and hope you have some quiet time, and I hope you get some thinking time, and I wish you all the very best. Thank you, and goodbye.